London, 1837. The city was an empire in miniature, smoke curling from the chimneys of Mayfair, silk carriages gliding past beggars on the Strand, and beneath the relentless drizzle, ambition glittered brighter than any diamond. The coronation year of Queen Victoria had summoned every title, every secret, and every ounce of vanity the nobility could muster. It was a season built on spectacle, and nowhere did it gleam more fiercely than within the marble columns of the Royal Opera House. Among the ocean of powdered faces and jeweled bodices sat Lady Eleanor Whitmore, the daughter of a viscount whose name society now uttered with distasteful curiosity. Once, her father had stood beside ministers and lords, a man of charm and influence. But one ill-timed scandal, whispers of embezzled funds and a rumored affair with a French diplomat's wife, had reduced the Whitmore name to a parlor joke. In the parlors of Belgravia, laughter often followed the mention of Eleanor's lineage, cloaked thinly in pity. Yet she endured it with a composure that bordered on defiance. If society expected her to wilt, she would not give them the satisfaction. That night, she entered the opera house wearing ivory silk that shimmered like the pale light of dawn. Her gown was modest compared to the flamboyant displays of the season's débutantes, yet somehow it drew more eyes. There was something deliberate in her simplicity, a refusal to compete, a quiet statement that dignity required no ornament. She took her seat beside her chaperone, an aging widow whose loyalty to the Whitmores survived long after their fortune had fled. Around them, the chatter of London's finest swelled like the overture of an unseen orchestra. Across the balconies, names of weight and history were murmured with reverence. Dukes, marquises, ministers, and heirs. The air itself seemed perfumed with lineage. Every glance, every nod, every carefully rehearsed smile carried the gravity of alliances. Yet Eleanor's gaze wandered not toward favor but toward freedom. The chandelier above, with its thousands of flickering candles, its fragile brilliance suspended by invisible chains. It seemed a fitting emblem for her world, radiant, heavy, and on the verge of collapse. The orchestra began. Rossini's melodies filled the great hall, and as bows met strings, conversation dissolved into admiration. Then came a subtle disturbance, a ripple through the tiers of velvet seats. Fans stilled, whispers stirred, and a single announcement moved through the audience like wind over grass. The Duke of Pembroke had arrived. Alexander Cavendish was the crown's rising star, a man whose valor in the final Napoleonic campaigns had won him medals and Queen Victoria's trust. The papers called him England's Iron Gentleman, intelligent, disciplined, incorruptible. But in person, he was quieter than rumor described. Tall, dark-haired, with a face carved by restraint more than vanity, he carried himself like one accustomed to silence being obeyed. His entrance into the royal box drew the expected tribute. Every person in attendance rose to their feet in reverence. Every person but one. Eleanor remained seated, her back straight, her expression unreadable. It was not rebellion born of spite, but of weariness, the exhaustion of bending to a hierarchy that had already condemned her. Around her, the rustle of silk grew audible, a collective intake of breath. Her chaperone tugged gently at her glove in panic, whispering her name. But Eleanor did not move. In that stillness, amid hundreds of eyes, her refusal became an act of quiet revolution. And then he saw her. From the height of the royal box, Alexander's gaze found the single figure unbowed in the sea of reverence. He did not frown. He did not nod. Instead, something within his expression, long habituated to indifference, flickered. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps recognition of a kindred obstinacy. For a brief instant, their eyes locked. The orchestra's swelling chords seemed to fade until only that silence remained between them. Two souls, one bound by scandal, the other by duty, recognizing, if not understanding, the rebellion that lived in the other. The moment passed. The Duke turned toward the Queen's representative beside him, his face once again composed, and Eleanor exhaled softly, as if waking from a dream. Yet the air around her had changed. Those near her avoided her gaze, others whispered behind fans painted with roses and swans. The widow beside her looked as if she might faint. But Eleanor sat motionless, her fingers interlaced on her lap, her pulse drumming beneath lace. She felt both terrified and liberated, unsure which sensation belonged to her and which to that stranger's eyes. When the first act ended, the applause thundered through the opera house, but for Eleanor, it sounded distant, muffled by thought. A gentleman in the next box leaned toward his companion, murmuring something with a smirk. Another lady glanced over and whispered behind her gloved hand. Eleanor caught only fragments. The Whitmore girl, again. Such nerve. She pretended not to hear. Inside, her composure trembled under the weight of humiliation, but pride held her upright. Moments later, a messenger boy approached her chaperone with a folded note. The old woman blinked in confusion but handed it to Eleanor, her hands shaking. The parchment was crisp, sealed with the crest of Pembroke, a rampant lion embossed in gold. Eleanor hesitated, torn between curiosity and dread. When she opened it, she found no declaration, no reprimand, only a single sentence written in precise, deliberate hand. In a hall full of obedience, one seat dared remain honest. She read it twice. The chaperone, too alarmed to inquire, watched her with anxious eyes. Eleanor slipped the note into her fan and whispered, "It is nothing." But it was not nothing. It was the beginning of something unnamed, something that unsettled her more than any scandal could. As the second act began, Eleanor tried to lose herself in the music. Yet her thoughts wandered to the Duke. To what kind of man would risk even a note to a woman like her? Was it pity? Amusement? Or did he recognize, beneath her defiance, a truth he envied? She had no answer, only the strange certainty that this was not the end of their acquaintance. When the final curtain fell, the audience rose in rapture. Outside, the night was cool and silvered by fog. Carriages lined the streets, footmen shouting names, horses stamping impatiently. Eleanor waited at the columned entrance, her gloved hand resting on her reticule, the city's gaslights reflecting in her eyes like scattered stars. Then, across the street, through the drifting mist, she saw him once more. Alexander Cavendish stood beside his carriage, cloak gathered around his shoulders, speaking briefly to his driver. For a heartbeat, he looked up, not searching, not hoping, simply knowing, and their eyes met again. This time, neither looked away. The sound of hooves broke the spell. His carriage rolled forward, disappearing into the labyrinth of London streets. Eleanor's escort urged her toward their own, but she lingered, staring at the place where he had stood. Something had shifted within her, subtle yet irrevocable, a recognition that she had not merely defied a duke that evening. She had defied the invisible chains that bound every woman of her class to silence. When she finally stepped into her carriage, the music of the opera still echoed faintly in her mind. The notes of rebellion, once unheard, now played quietly in her chest. London's night pressed close, heavy with secrets, and somewhere beyond its fog-veiled rooftops, a man bound by honor began to question what honor truly meant. The city slept. But the story, their story, had already begun. In the weeks that followed the opera, London spoke of little else. The Whitmore defiance, as the gossip sheets christened it, became both scandal and amusement. In parlors and tea-rooms, her name was tossed about like a jesting refrain. Some claimed the Duke had been insulted beyond forgiveness. Others swore he had been intrigued. No one knew which tale was true, but every whisper carried the same undertone, that Lady Eleanor Whitmore had forgotten her place. And yet, in a world ruled by appearances, the Duke himself remained silent. His silence was not indifference. It was calculation, the measured restraint of a man who understood the peril of being misunderstood. Alexander Cavendish had spent half his life under scrutiny. Decorated at 28 for bravery at Salamanca, widowed before 30, he had learned that the cost of honor was loneliness. Now, at 34, the crown relied upon him for counsel and discretion. Duty was his language, solitude his companion. He had not expected a woman's defiance, a single refusal amid obedience, to disturb his ordered world. But since that night, her image lingered like a melody unfinished, haunting his thoughts at Parliament, following him through the long corridors of Pembroke House, intruding even upon his prayers. He had not intended to write to her again, but intention was powerless against memory. One evening, he took up his quill, hesitated, then wrote another line, a fragment from Cicero, asterisk, "Within the heart lies a republic no crown may rule." Asterisk, he sent it and signed, knowing she would recognize the hand. Eleanor received the note 2 days later while arranging charity parcels for the parish poor. The sight of the Pembroke crest made her pulse quicken, though she told herself she should burn it unread. Instead, she traced the Latin words with her fingertip and felt a strange ache of recognition. He spoke not as a duke, but as a man questioning his own station. She folded the paper carefully and hid it within her journal, unsure whether she feared discovery or hoped for it. Her days passed beneath the scrutiny of London's eyes. Invitations ceased, then resumed only from those who enjoyed observing ruin. She endured luncheons thick with veiled pity, dinners filled with barbed compliments. But a quiet strength had begun to grow in her, the kind that blossoms only after one has nothing left to lose. Each time she thought of the Duke, she felt not adoration but understanding. They were both prisoners, he of duty, she of disgrace, each staring through different bars at the same unreachable sky. Their next meeting was unplanned. A cold rain swept through Westminster as Eleanor delivered alms to a widow of the war, and there, beneath the iron arch of the cloister, stood Alexander, speaking with a bishop. When he saw her, he paused mid-sentence. Rain beaded on his coat, glistened in his hair, softened the austerity of his features. For a moment, the clamor of the city faded, only the rain and their silence remained. "You are a difficult woman to forget," he said at last, voice low enough to escape the bishop's notice. "And you," she replied, forcing steadiness, "are a difficult man to ignore." He smiled, the smallest betrayal of discipline, and handed her his umbrella. "Then perhaps we are even." Their exchange lasted less than a minute, yet the simplicity of it unsettled her more than all the whispers combined. She walked away drenched, carrying the memory of his words as if they had been a promise. After that day, they began to encounter each other as though London itself conspired to make them meet. At a gala for veterans, she found him watching her from across the hall, refusing introductions until she had acknowledged him with the faintest nod. In Hyde Park, during her morning rides, his horse would appear at the curve of the path, his greeting polite, his gaze searching. Their conversations were brief, their topics harmless: poetry, music, the unrest in Spain, yet beneath the surface ran an unspoken current neither dared to name. For Alexander, these moments became the only hours that felt real. He began to dread the return to his official duties, where every word was weighed, every gesture watched. In Eleanor, he saw a freedom that terrified and fascinated him, the freedom of one who has survived disgrace and found courage in its ashes. Yet he also knew the danger of indulging such fascination. The Queen's advisers had already begun to whisper of alliances, of a future union between him and Lady Arabella Fairfax, daughter of an earl whose loyalty to the throne was beyond question. It would be a match of advantage, one expected of him. To defy it would risk not only his standing but hers. Eleanor, too, understood the stakes. Though she tried to quiet her heart, her thoughts betrayed her. In the privacy of her chamber, she found herself rereading his notes, hearing his voice in the rhythm of her pulse. It was absurd, she told herself, the fantasy of a fallen lady and a man too far above her reach. Yet when she looked into the mirror, she no longer saw shame. She saw someone reborn through defiance, someone capable of being loved, if only briefly, before the world reclaimed its order. The tension between them reached its height at the midsummer masquerade held at Kensington Palace. The evening was a parade of opulence: gold brocade, jeweled masks, chandeliers dripping light like molten honey. Beneath their disguises, London's elite plotted marriages and betrayals with equal artistry. Eleanor arrived late, wearing a mask of black lace that rendered her unrecognizable to most. She had almost convinced herself she would not see him there. But he was waiting. Cloaked in midnight velvet, his mask simple and unadorned, he stepped from the crowd as though drawn by fate. "If I did not know your defiance, I might not have recognized you," he murmured. "And if I did not know your restraint," she said softly, "I might have mistaken you for free." He offered his hand. She hesitated, then placed hers within it. The orchestra swelled, and they moved together into the dance, not as duke and fallen lady, but as two souls momentarily released from the tyranny of expectation. Their steps were precise, elegant, yet every turn drew them closer until her breath caught at his nearness. The scent of rain still lingered on him, mingling with a faint trace of sandalwood. "You should not be here," he whispered, though his hand refused to let hers go. "Neither should you," she replied. He looked down at her then, the distance between them collapsing into something perilous and beautiful. You make me forget the Empire. The words struck her like a confession. Before she could answer, the clock began to chime midnight, echoing through the marble hall. She stepped back, her pulse trembling, and vanished into the crowd before duty could reclaim him. When the last bell faded, he stood alone beneath the chandeliers, mask still in hand, aware that something within him had shifted beyond repair. The man who had commanded battalions and courted monarchs now found himself defeated by the honesty of a woman society had scorned. That night, Eleanor returned home to find another letter waiting, sealed in black wax. It bore no crest, only her name. She opened it with trembling fingers. Should we meet again, it will not be by chance. She read it once, twice, and pressed it to her heart. In the hush of her room, with the city sleeping beyond the window, she understood that the line dividing defiance and desire had already vanished. What remained was choice, a choice that would either redeem or destroy them both. The morning after the masquerade, London awoke to a storm, not of rain, but of rumor. By noon, the tale had spread from Kensington's marble halls to every drawing-room in Mayfair. The Duke of Pembroke was seen dancing with a disgraced lady, they whispered, and the lady's mask was black as mourning. Names were not spoken openly, but everyone knew. The scandal was too delicious, the implications too vast. By evening, pamphlets circulated with crude sketches of a masked couple beneath chandeliers, and the phrase, "the opera rebel," reappeared in print, reigniting society's cruel delight. Eleanor read the papers in silence. Her hands trembled, though not from shame, from realization. What had begun as curiosity had now become dangerous. The Duke's reputation might weather gossip, but hers would not survive it twice. And yet, beneath fear, there flickered a strange calm. She had already lost everything that could be taken. What remained was her will, and the memory of a single night when she had felt seen. For Alexander, the consequences arrived swiftly. Summoned to the palace, he was met not by the Queen herself but by her chief adviser, Lord Melbury, whose thin smile concealed steel. "Your Grace," Melbury said, pacing before the Duke's chair, "England adores your discipline. Do not trade it for sentiment." The warning was clear. The Duke's duty was not his own happiness. It was the stability of a nation still trembling from reform. Melbury reminded him of his pending courtship to Lady Arabella Fairfax, a union long anticipated, politically convenient, and now in jeopardy. Alexander listened in silence, his face impassive. Only when the adviser departed did he allow himself to breathe. His reflection in the tall mirror seemed foreign, the medals, the starched collar, the emblem of obedience. What was honor, he wondered, if it required the sacrifice of truth? He remembered Eleanor's defiance, her eyes unflinching before the entire opera house, and felt an ache of envy. She had faced the world without a crown to protect her. He had worn one all his life and felt only its weight. Days turned into weeks. He avoided public gatherings, pleading affairs of state, yet every absence fueled fresh gossip. Letters from his peers arrived daily, urging caution. But there was one he could not ignore, a short note written in his sister's delicate hand. "Alexander, she will be ruined entirely. If you mean to protect her, you must act before others destroy her name." He read it again and again, each word a blade of truth. That evening, beneath a restless sky, he went to her. The Whitmore residence, once grand, now stood dim and weary, its gates unguarded. Eleanor met him in the drawing-room, her expression poised but pale. He removed his gloves slowly, as though buying time before the inevitable. "You should not have come," she said softly. "Then we are both where we should not be," he answered. They stood apart, the silence thick with everything unsaid. Finally she spoke again, her voice steady but aching. "The world believes what it wishes. I have grown accustomed to its cruelty. But you have something still to lose." "Perhaps that is why I am here," he replied. "Because I am tired of living by the mercy of what others believe." Her composure wavered for the first time. "And what do you believe, Your Grace?" He looked at her, really looked, not as a duke, but as a man stripped of pretense. "That what began as defiance has become the only honest thing in my life." For a moment, time dissolved. The fire crackled softly, The rain whispered against the windows. When he stepped closer, she did not retreat. His hand brushed hers, a gesture simple, sacred, and final. Yet before he could speak again, a sound shattered the stillness. The door opening, a voice of fury. It was her father. Viscount Whitmore, hollow-eyed and trembling with anger, stood framed in the doorway. "Is this how far you've fallen, Eleanor? To welcome your ruin under my roof?" His voice broke between pride and despair. Turning to the Duke, he spat. "You, sir, have toyed with what little remains of my family's name. Leave, before I forget your title." Alexander bowed slightly, his restraint masking the storm within. "My lord," he said quietly, "it was never my intention to dishonor her. But neither can I deny what binds us." The Viscount's answer was cold as stone. "Then you have condemned her. Go." Eleanor's plea, "Father, please," was silenced by the slam of the door. When she turned back, Alexander was already gone. The echo of his departure lingered long after the carriage wheels faded into the night. In the days that followed, London devoured the scandal. Rumors grew teeth, lies became headlines. Eleanor withdrew from society altogether, her name banished from guest lists, her letters returned unopened. Even her father, consumed by bitterness, avoided her gaze. Yet through it all, she felt no regret, only the dull ache of something unfinished. Then, one morning, the world changed again. News broke that the Duke of Pembroke had resigned his royal appointment. His seat in the Privy Council surrendered. His engagement to Lady Arabella declined. The decision sent shockwaves through Parliament. Some called it madness, others, treason to the Crown's favor. But his official statement was brief. A man may serve his country with loyalty, but he must serve his conscience first. Eleanor read the words by the window, the sunlight trembling through lace curtains. Her throat tightened as she imagined the cost of such defiance. The city would turn on him now as it had on her. For a long moment, she stood in silence, her heart breaking not from loss but from the unbearable knowledge that he had chosen her at the expense of everything else. Weeks passed before she saw him again. It was autumn, the air sharp with the scent of rain and leaves. The Royal Opera House stood nearly empty, its grand season ended. She wandered there at dusk, drawn by memory more than reason. The chandeliers were dark, the stage bare, yet the ghosts of music seemed to hum faintly through the stillness. She stepped onto the stage where once she had refused to rise, tracing the curve of the crimson curtains with her fingertips. Behind her, footsteps echoed softly. She turned, and there he was. Alexander looked older, freer, his expression unburdened. No crest adorned his coat, no chain of office glinted at his throat. He carried nothing of his former grandeur, and yet, in that simplicity, he seemed more a duke than ever before. "I thought I might find you here," he said, voice quiet, reverent. "I come here when I forget who I am," she murmured. "Then we are both in the right place." They stood in the half-light, neither speaking, neither needing to. At last he reached for her hand. "Eleanor," he said, her name a vow, "the world we knew is gone. But if you will have me, without title, without favor, then what remains will be ours to build." Tears welled, but her smile held steady. "You left everything." He shook his head. "No. I kept what was worth keeping." And there, beneath the silent chandeliers, they embraced, not in triumph, but in peace. Theirs was not a love that conquered kingdoms, but one that defied them. Outside, the city hummed with its endless hunger for scandal, but within those walls, the noise of the world fell away. History would remember the Duke's resignation as a mystery, the scandal of the opera lady as legend. But those who looked deeper whispered the truth. That one night in London, a man who had everything and a woman who had nothing met as equals, and changed the meaning of honor forever. When they left the opera house hand in hand, dawn was breaking, and the first light touched the streets like absolution. London stirred, unaware that somewhere in its heart, love, quiet, relentless, and unyielding, had rewritten the story of power itself.